On this episode of True Crime Chronicles, a brutal murder, a decades-long mystery, and an ending no one saw coming. And later, the body of a young college co-ed is found in a field outside of Denver, Colorado. The case lies cold for 40 years until forensic science leads to an arrest and a shocking confession.
Welcome to DBL's True Crime Chronicles. I'm Sam Shocker. James Essel walked away from a career in banking to run a small market and live a life of peace and quiet in rural Maryland. It was a decision that would lead to his untimely death and an almost 3-decade search for his killer.
March 22nd, 1992. A snowy Sunday evening in rural Maryland. Montgomery County Police are called to the Sugarloaf Mountain Market in Comus, a small farming community about 50 miles west of Baltimore. 57-year-old James Essel, the owner of the modest market and two-pump gas station, has been found dead on the floor of his store by a customer. Essel had purchased the store only 2 years earlier, leaving behind a career in banking to run it. He liked the peace and quiet of the shop, which reminded him of growing up by the ocean in Ghana. Residents of the tiny hamlet are stunned. Friends and loved ones are devastated, including Essel's 4 adult daughters. An investigation reveals little, but authorities piece together a possible scenario. A person entered the market at around 5:30 p.m. on the evening of March 22nd. They purchased several items, including a bottle of wine. After paying, for reasons unknown, the customer hits James Essel over the head with the bottle of wine before stabbing him 29 times in the chest, throat, and back with the broken bottle, and authorities also believe with a knife. As Essel bleeds to death, the assailant steals a small amount of money from the register and disappears into the night. Despite the theft, police do not believe robbery was the motive. Defensive wounds on Essel's hands and arms, as well as blood not belonging to Essel found at the crime scene, lead police to believe there was some sort of struggle. A DNA profile is created from the blood sample, but it repeatedly fails to generate any hits when compared to the national database. And with no witnesses coming forward or any sort of security footage to analyze, the case eventually goes cold. James's family is left not only to mourn his loss, but also to wonder why.
I don't know, who would do something like that?
More than 2 decades pass. Cold case detectives decide to take another look at the crime. With the evidence still preserved, they submit an unidentified blood sample found at the scene for DNA phenotyping, a technology unavailable in 1992. Eventually, a DNA match leads them to a close relative of the killer. In February of 2020, 51-year-old auto mechanic Hans Alejandro Hewitts, a man with no criminal history, is positively identified as the murderer of James Essel some 28 years earlier. On the morning of February 12th, warrant in hand, authorities descend upon the home Hewitt shares with his wife, a retired police officer, on a cul-de-sac in Virginia Beach, Virginia. They confront Hewitts in his vehicle. A standoff ensues. As officers negotiate his surrender, Hewitts brandishes a firearm.
According to his arrest warrant, Hans Alejandro Hewitz was facing charges of first-degree murder and robbery. To obtain a warrant, a law enforcement officer only needs to provide sufficient information to establish probable cause that a crime was committed. No motive needs to be listed. The reason behind this crime was still a mystery, and the only person who knew how and why it happened had just exchanged gunfire with sheriff's officers and U.S. Marshals. More still ahead when DBL's True Crime Chronicles returns. Welcome back to DBL's True Crime Chronicles. 28 years after a shocking and horrific crime, it looked like the perpetrator of the brutal bludgeoning and stabbing death of 57-year-old James Essel would finally be brought to justice.
Montgomery County, Maryland police, along with U.S. Marshals, have a warrant for 51-year-old mechanic Hans Alejandro Hewitz on charges of first-degree murder and robbery of James Essel at the Sugarloaf Mountain Market in Comus, Maryland on March 22, 1992. An armed standoff with law enforcement ends in the shooting death of Hewitz outside of his home in Virginia Beach, bringing an end to an almost 30-year manhunt.
Drop the gun!
After decades without any progress in the case, the family of James Essel is stunned.
I was in a dream, like I couldn't believe what I was hearing at the time. One, that it was over and they found the guy and he had been just living his life all these years. I was just in shock.
With no criminal history and a belief he acted alone, the chance to uncover the reason for this seemingly senseless crime appears to die with Hewitz.
We're joined by reporter Bruce Leshan from WUSA in Washington, D.C. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us. A violent ending to a nearly 30-year manhunt. Police finally found a suspect and shot and killed him. So tell me, where does the case stand now, and what is the protocol for that officer involved?
You kind of heard how many times they tried to get him to put the gun down on the tape. That's what's remarkable in this case.
Right.
At one point, they say he waved the gun at them, and they felt like they needed to take action. So that's what's being looked into right now.
Interesting.
All right, Bruce, can you just tell us how the cops were able to get this guy, and did he know that they were outside surrounding his home?
What it really is about is kind of a combination of old-style genealogy, you know, looking at people's family trees, and kind of the latest cutting-edge DNA technology. So they were able to come up with a DNA profile from the blood spatters at the scene at that store. And that led them to a guy that they went and they took a swab from him. It turned out he wasn't the right guy. They took that sample back, looked at it, determined that it was a very close relative, either a father or a brother of the killer from the scene. The father was dead, and the guy only had one brother, so that's how they got their man.
Now, Bruce, this
Isn't
all
that
unfolded.
Amazing.
This all unfolded over the past months. How is James' daughter coping with the news, and what did she tell you?
Her sister passed away before the cops figured out who had killed their father. She was terribly sad about that.
Wow.
Perpetua is glad that there's some closure here, that there's some answers, but she's mad that she'll never know why. I mean, here her dad was killed for what seems like no reason, and because the accused killer died in this shootout, she will never know for certain why he would have done it. There was no reason to do it. I mean, it's so often hear in these kinds of cases, James Essel was a guy that would give you the shirt off his back. He was a guy who came from Ghana, worked his way up. He'd been a banker, he'd been a restaurant owner, decided to settle in this small town and open this store out in rural Montgomery County because it reminded him of the hills of Ghana where he came from. And then somebody comes into his store, stabs him 29 times, part of it with the wine bottle that he had actually just purchased in the store.
God, such a tragic ending. I'm glad she got closure, but I know there's more questions left open, like the motive, for instance. We want to thank you, Bruce, so much. To read more on this case, visit WUSA.com.
But for all the media analysis, it is James Essel's daughter, Perpetua, who comes away with the last word.
Wish the guy could have served time for the crime, but the fact that he's dead, it's just a relief. I can't even imagine, how can someone live like that all these years knowing, what he did?
While James Essel's family feels some sense of closure with the identification of Hans Hewitts as the killer, his death does rob them of ever finding an answer to the one question that has haunted them for 30 years and will continue to haunt them for the rest of their lives. Why? We'll be right back with more of DBL's True Crime Chronicles. Welcome back. Genetic genealogy, the use of DNA profiling combined with the more traditional methods of determining biological relationships, has become a common tool in modern investigations. The kind of tool aspiring journalist Helen Pruszynski could only imagine having at her disposal back in 1980, and the same technology which decades later would help catch her killer.
21-year-old Helen Pruszynski was a junior at Wheaton College in Massachusetts who dreamt of a career in journalism when she accepted an internship at radio station KHOW in Denver, Colorado. Her internship began in early January 1980. Personable, intelligent, and attractive, she made an immediate impression upon new coworkers like Bob Scott.
Although I had only worked with her a very short time, I was convinced right away that she was very bright and had a great sense of humor.
Helen commuted to and from work every day by bus, as the stop was only a few blocks from where she was staying with an aunt in the nearby suburb of Englewood. On January 16, 1980, only 2 weeks into her internship, Helen got off the bus after work, but never made it home. Helen's aunt called police at 10:30 p.m. to report her niece missing. A search was begun. It did not last long.
It's believed that Ms. Pruszynski got off her bus after work here Wednesday night. She was abducted sometime after that.
The following day, Helen's lifeless body was spotted by a passerby in a field in Douglas County. Her hands had been bound behind her.
Ms. Pruszynski's body was found early Thursday. She'd been sexually assaulted and stabbed.
Helen died from the reported 9 stab wounds in her back. Her former KHOW colleague Bob Scott helped identify the body.
This was the toughest assignment I ever had. As a reporter, I'd seen a lot of people dead, but this was a friend of mine.
Authorities began an intensive investigation and manhunt.
First 48 hours, I'd say, are probably very critical. We make as many contacts as we can immediately after a thing like this in an effort to try to talk with people when their memories are still in focus and that they can remember substantial information.
After combing the entire Denver metropolitan area for months looking for witnesses or clues, police ultimately come up empty-handed. Although investigators had collected evidence from Helen's body and clothing at the crime scene, this was well before the age of advanced DNA analysis and any sort of shared national criminal indexing system. In the years that followed, police released a sketch from a description someone provided under hypnosis. It provided no fresh leads. Law enforcement would revisit the case in 1997, 2013, and 2017. All their efforts proved futile. Until 2018, when the Douglas County Sheriff's Office decided to give forensic genealogy a try.
We found people that shared a lot of the same DNA.
United Data Connect, a company belonging to former Denver District Attorney Mitch Morris, started to investigate all of these matches. They ultimately found a relative, a woman in Georgia named Jessie Still, and who turned out to be a distant cousin of the man who raped and killed Helen Pruszynski.
I did not know him. I was a small link, and them narrowing it down is, I don't even know. It's surreal.
The woman had 2 sons who authorities were able to locate. One was almost instantly ruled out.
Once we started working the genealogy, coming down his family tree, it appeared that his mother was a dead end, but she wasn't.
The other was Curtis Allen White, now known as James Curtis Clanton. A mugshot of Clanton's from a domestic violence arrest in 1998 showed a remarkable resemblance to the sketch released by police years earlier. In 1975, the man then known as Curtis Allen White sexually assaulted a woman at knife point in Arkansas and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Only 4 years later, he was out on parole. And on March 6, 1979, he moved into the home of a former counselor who was now living in Colorado. At the time of Helen Pruszynski's rape and murder, Clanton was living in Inglewood.
Over the years following Helen Pruszynski's rape and murder, James Clanton had married twice. His first wife left him after 30 days, and his second marriage ended around the same time of that 1998 arrest for domestic violence. A history of violence had been established, and now police knew who he was. But identifying him and catching him are 2 entirely different things. The conclusion when DBL's True Crime Chronicles returns. Thanks to the marriage of DNA evidence and genetic genealogy, in 2019, James Curtis Clanton was identified as the man who raped and killed 21-year-old radio station intern Helen Pruszynski in Inglewood, Colorado, in January of 1980. Almost 40 years after this horrible crime, it was now a matter of locating Clanton and bringing him to justice.
James Curtis Clanton was found to be living in Lake Butler, Florida. Around Thanksgiving of 2019, Douglas County Sheriff's Office detectives spent a week following him around the small Florida city with the assistance of local authorities. One night, Clanton sat at a local bar drinking beer after beer out of a mug. The moment he left, a detective who had been watching him collected that same mug as evidence. On December 4th, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation confirmed that the DNA on the mug matched the DNA from the crime scene. Clanton was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and second-degree kidnapping. Helen Pruszynski's only living relative, her sister, speaks publicly about the arrest.
It's hard to really put into words, the feelings I have, because you're happy, but it's like bittersweet. It's really not happiness, but it's just a calmness, I guess, that I can feel, knowing that justice will prevail.
Clanton is extradited from Florida to Colorado. He confesses to the murder on the way to the airport.
How then do you plead to murder in the first degree after deliberation?
Guilty.
The turn of events sends shockwaves through the national media.
We're joined by investigative reporter Kevin Vaughn from 9 News in Denver. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. There's been a huge break in the case. James Clanton pled guilty, right? But did he ever say why he went after Helen? Ever?
He has not said that yet. He's scheduled for sentencing April 10th, and that's the time when he will have a chance to make a statement in court. Whether he'll talk about why he did this, I guess, is another question.
Do you think he will, knowing this case?
Well, he did 2 things that are unusual. He immediately waived extradition after he was arrested in Florida, and they brought him right back here, and then he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, did not put the family, the Pruszynski family, through the pain of a trial and that sort of thing. So, I don't know.
Interesting.
I have to ask you this, Kevin. This took place in the 1980s. The law was different then. Does that mean that we might see him get released early, or like how does this affect his sentence?
Yeah, so the 1980 first-degree murder law in Colorado, he will be eligible for parole after 20 years.
Wow.
That doesn't mean he'll be paroled. He'd still have to go to the parole board and have it approved. But he's in his early 60s, so he's going to serve at least into his 80s. And you know, it's hard to predict what a parole board might do 20 years down the road. But he will be eligible for parole. Unlike today, somebody convicted of first-degree murder today gets life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Now, there are reports that James could possibly be linked to other cases in Colorado back in the 90s. Have police followed up on that lead?
That is being investigated. One of the issues is that the statute of limitations on sexual assault is short. It's just a few years, unlike murder, which there is no statute of limitations. So they are looking at some older unsolved sexual assaults to see if there are links. To date, they have not made any of those.
Wow. That's always why I've pushed for longer statute of limitations for sexual assault victims. Some of them can't come forward, some don't remember, or things like this happen.
Right.
Kevin, thank you so much for being here. To read more on this case, please visit 9news.com.
Clanton's sentencing those who knew and loved Helen make sure their voices are heard.
Really just wanted to get it off his chest. It was very unusual to hear that kind of remorse and gratitude for the opportunities that he knew he didn't deserve, but that he got.
Clanton's lawyer apologizes on his behalf. He receives the maximum sentence.
Mr. Clanton, I sentence you to a sentence in the Department of Corrections for the rest of your natural life.
James Curtis Clanton is serving his sentence at the Bent County Correctional Facility outside of Pueblo, Colorado. His earliest eligibility for parole is December 2039. At his sentencing, Judge Teresa Slade recited a line from a poem written by Helen Pruszynski. "Let us live today with every hopeful promise of tomorrow." She then added, "Mr. Clanton, you get to keep having that. How you face that is up to you." I'm Sam Shocker. Tune in next time to DBL's True Crime Chronicles.